Let's take a minute to talk about reflections in Unity. Now, we don't have any object that's outright metallic in our scene, but if we select our door, you'll notice that the material does have a high level of smoothness. This means that reflection would contribute pretty nicely to all of the objects in our scene, and just in case we do decide to have some metallic objects later on, it's good to understand how reflections are going to work. So I'm going to start by going to my directional light and actually rotating this so we have a more brightly lit day scene again. There we go. And I'm going to create a new object. I'm going to go to Game Object, 3D Object, and let's make this a sphere. Drag this out. You could see that as I'm moving new objects around in the scene, they're being picked up by our light probe group, and it's just showing what sector our object is in. So I'm going to move this down to right here, and I'm going to create a new material. So I'm going to go to the Materials folder, right-click, Create, Material, and I'm just going to call this Reflective Material. I'm going to apply this to the sphere. And now let's start playing with the values a little bit. Let's drag this down. So I'm going to set the metallic all the way up to 1 and the smoothness all the way up to 1 as well. And we could see in our scene, our object appears to become chrome-like. But there's a problem with this. It's only reflecting the skybox. We can see that we have the sun here, we have the ground and the sky, but our Cornell box and all of its contents aren't showing up at all, even though this is a fully reflective object. So what's going on? By default, Unity is only going to reflect the contents of the skybox, and that's it. In order to reflect other objects in our scene, we need to create a reflection probe. This can be found in the same section as our light probe. So let's go ahead and create it. I'm going to go to Game Object, Light, and I'm going to choose Reflection Probe. This will create a large box that looks a little bit like a collider, and this represents the bounds that our reflection probe is going to work within. So it's only going to reflect anything that's within these bounds. If I zoom in, we can see that already our chrome ball is starting to reflect our Cornell box, but let's get this aligned accurately. So let's go to the top view, and I'm going to kind of scoot this more towards the center. There we go. And let's just go back to perspective. It's a little hard to see the outlines of the box. We can edit this much like we do a collider by coming over to the reflection probe group and clicking on this first icon that looks like 3 vertices. Now we have the little handles on each side that we could pull into place. So I'm going to do just that. Select the bottom. And that looks pretty good. So I'm going to exit edit mode. Let's zoom in, and sure enough, our chrome ball is now showing all the objects in our scene except for our character. Once again, reflections can only be used with static objects by default. We can see that in the inspector under type, and it's set to baked. Now this is for efficiency reasons. Reflections are still extremely expensive to run all the time in games, so it's best that they're used sparingly, and when they are used, for the most part, having them stick to static objects helps out a lot. However, if we click on the drop-down for baked, we could see that we do have the option for real-time, and if that's selected, our player does appear. Now just a quick note, if we zoom in, we could also see kind of this black sphere right here. That's actually our chrome sphere being reflected in our reflection probe. We can get rid of that by setting a custom layer on our sphere and then coming down into the reflection probe's inspector and just choosing a culling mask that doesn't include the sphere. But we're not going to worry about that because we're not going to stay on real time for this. I'm going to scroll back up. Notice that once I switched over to real time, we have a couple new options here, the top of which is refresh mode, and it's set to on awake. Let me show you what this is doing. I'm going to quickly go into play mode. I'm going to select my dwarf hero. Let's get him in the reflection. There he is. And I'm going to move him around. notice that the reflection doesn't update to show the character moving around. And that's because our reflection probe is set to on awake, which means it's going to check for dynamic objects as soon as the game starts, and that's it. If we switch this over to on every frame and try again, we can see that our character is reflecting in real time on the chrome sphere. The problem is that this is extremely expensive and should be used very sparingly. This is something that you would really have in a specialized scenario. Say, for example, if you had a gameplay element that was a mirror and it required the player to observe themselves moving in its reflection for some reason. This would really be the only time that you would be taking advantage of a real-time reflection probe. Otherwise, it's just not worth the processor hit. So I'm going to set the type back to baked, and I just want to highlight why this is important to a scene without fully metallic objects. So let's take a look at our door here. We already established that it has a higher smoothness level. So with my reflection probe selected, I'm going to actually disable it and keep your eye on the door. With the reflection probe off, our door looks a lot more flat. Whereas if we turn it back on, we're getting color information. We could see that we're getting some red spillage over here, some green over here, and overall our door just looks better. It looks more seated in the world. The shadows are a little bit deeper, and overall it just looks better. So even if you don't have fully reflective objects in your scene, if you have objects that are smooth, it's worth bringing in a reflection probe just to help seat them a little bit better in the environment. In our next clip, we're going to take a look at point lights.